One more person.
Extend courtesy.
Well, it's one of the.
They already worked in the wrong place.
Yes, I'm glad you're ready to go.
Okay, thank you. All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Planning Coordination Advisory Committee meeting of December 1st, 2021. I called the meeting to order, and I need to call roll. Councilmember Miles is not going to be with us tonight. Board Member Garvey is here. Supervisor Alcorn.
Here.
Supervisor Glass.
Here.
Supervisor Franklin. Here. Vice Mayor Elizabeth Bennett Parker.
Here.
Joining us remotely. And I need to ask you where you joining us from.
I am joining you from Springfield.
Springfield, okay. That's a good answer.
She might be moving.
We can see
On
that.
my way to
Thank you.
Richmond, yes.
Thank you for joining us. That's good. Councilmember Duncan,
Yes, ma'am.
Councilmember Steely.
Yes.
Oh, I know he's here.
He just took a phone call.
Okay, okay. Vice Mayor Spesky. Here. Vice Mayor Banks.
Here.
And Councilmember Fredericks.
Here.
Vice Mayor Martinez. And he was supposed to join us remotely also, but I don't see him on yet. So we'll wait.
I am here.
Oh, you are there. Okay, we just can't see you, but I'm glad you're here. Excellent. And where are
If
you?
you really want to look at my pretty face.
Of course we do. Can I ask where you're joining us from tonight?
My basement.
Okay. Do we need okay, that's fine. All right,
Leesburg.
we know you're in Leesburg. Okay.
I'll find him.
And Councilmember Malone.
Here.
Okay, excellent. All right, the summary notes of, and John, you're here. Great, gotcha. The summary notes of October 27th, 2021 meeting, are there any changes to those notes? Okay, those pass. Okay, approval of performance measure weightings for the transaction update. This is the big item of this evening, so.
Big item of the year.
Yes, yes, that's what I should have said.
Thanks for great turnout tonight. This is wonderful. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Keith Jasper. I'm the principal here at Nbta in charge of transportation planning and programming. And this evening we're going to have the second part of a two-part action process, with the first part being last month or your last meeting when you recommended a set of goals, objectives and performance measures for the transaction updates. Those recommendations were forwarded to the authority at their meeting on November 18th and were approved by the authority with a teeny kind of additional kind of footnote, as it were, stating that transit may include HOV, high frequency vehicles. So that change has been reflected in the presentation that Haroon's just loading up, but I'll keep going regardless in the interest of time. You do have some score sheets which Haroon has been handing out. We'll be coming back to those in just a moment, but if you want to doodle some numbers down on in the row next to your name for each of the 10 performance measures, please feel free to go ahead. Just noting that the arithmetic says that it must add up to 100. So you can put down whatever numbers you want, but it cannot exceed 100, and we'd rather it didn't go under 100 as well, because that complicates the math. So you have that with you. We'll come to that shortly. In terms of where we are in the process, subject to your action tonight, then we'll be taking your recommended weightings for the performance measures to the authority, together with corresponding numbers for the Technical Advisory Committee and the Planning and Programming Committee, which have already met and come up with their recommendations. And all those recommendations will be going to the authority for its meeting on December 9th, which is next Thursday. And I believe, Chair Gobert, you maybe are going to be with us in person that night.
I can try and make that happen. What time is that on December 9th?
It's 7.
Oh, no, 6:30.
6:30, it's the early meeting.
Yeah, we're meeting earlier.
Okay,
So we may not get to this bit until.
Okay.
So, I mean, subject to all of that, the rest of the schedule here is shown on the screen, and we're still targeting November of next year as the target date for adoption of transaction. If you go to the next slide. Just a couple of quick refreshers in terms of what we mean by goals and core values. I think this is mostly kind of ingrained now, but just to kind of reconfirm, goals are what we want to achieve, and there are 3 goals which were part of what was approved at you recommended at your last meeting and approved by the authority. And those 3 goals are to enhance mobility, increase accessibility, and improve resiliency. And then from those goals, we go down to objectives and performance measures, which we'll be coming to in just a moment. But we also have these core values: equity, sustainability, and safety, which are not being measured in the same way as the goals, but they are important because they kind of represent how we want to achieve the goals. So there's kind of a subtle, nuanced difference between them, but they're both equally important. And just kind of to refresh for the group's benefit, how do we actually use weighted performance measures in our processes? So we're talking here about transaction tonight, but it does affect our 6-year program as well. Within transaction, a long-range plan, we calculate these what we call transaction project ratings. And in part, we do this to be compliant with legislation that we refer to as HB 599 from 2012, which requires that the authority takes certain steps before it funds projects, part of that being to assess how they impact congestion. So within transaction, the weighted performance measures are the major quantitative tool that we use. When it comes to the 6-year program, we'll also be using the same performance measures for the 6-year program that's currently open, what we call our fiscal year 2022 to 2027 program. We'll be using the same weighted performance measures to look at individual candidate projects. But in our 6-year program, the transaction project ratings are one of 3 quantitative scales that we use, with the others being congestion reduction relative to cost and long-term benefit, which are both things that are also kind of embedded within the Code of Virginia that we have to adhere to. But in addition to those 3 quantitative scales, we also have a number of qualitative factors that we look at, including things like past performance, modal and geographic balance, external funding sources, and so on. So, and then at the end of the process, we gather public comment as well. So the weighted performance measures are still in the mix, but maybe that they're kind of diluted somewhat by all the other quantitative and qualitative factors that we take into account. The important thing to remember is that in transaction, which is a fiscally and geographically unconstrained plan, that there is no commitment on anyone's part to fund the projects that are in the plan. Okay, it helps us to evaluate the projects that are in the plan, and if the projects that we want to fund are not in the plan, then we cannot fund them. But in and of itself, the ratings that we use in transaction are not project selection decisions. That's all entirely in the 6-year program. So that's kind of our rambling explanation of how we use the performance measures. On the next slide, just to recap, although this slide says recommended at the top, these are actually the approved goals, objectives, and performance measures. So just for reference back to what you did at last month's meeting and what the authority did at its meeting in November. the performance measures, and there are 10 of them, from A1 down to G1 you see on here. I think I characterized at the last meeting that these represent the totality of what we've heard from this and other committees need to be measured, but the weightings, which we're just about to talk about, really determines the emphasis that we place within these performance measures, so that they're not necessarily equal. And the extent to which they are or are not equal is a policy decision, and we're looking for our statutory committees, this one and the technical advisory committee, plus our planning and programming committee, to weigh in on that kind of policy direction, and ultimately the authority will make the decision as to which way they want to go. But that's what we're talking about tonight, is weighting those performance measures. I just want to touch again on that right-hand column, alignment with the core values. You do see the scales for equity, the kind of the leaf in the hand representing sustainability, and the person with a reflective jacket and a hard hat representing safety. So every performance measure has got at least one core value associated with it. Some have got two, and one has got three of the core values associated with it. So again, it's kind of showing, on the one hand, there's the goals of what we're trying to accomplish. The performance measures tell us how well we're accomplishing it, and the core values tell us how we want to go about it. But there is crossover in there as well, which makes it quite complicated. Ms. Levin is here from our consultant team again this evening, and probably what I should do now before we get into the fun part is just pause, so that if there are any questions on anything I've said, or any questions on anything that's on the screen, or things that are not on the screen but related to things that are on the screen, such as the methodology that we use to calculate performance measures, which, believe me, there's a very long technical memo that goes behind that. It's all been thought through. It's all very coherent and comprehensive. There's nothing in there we haven't shared with you as we've gone along through this process, or in response to your questions or clarification requests. But we probably haven't talked about everything that's in that technical memo. But I'm sure Dahlia would be more than happy to, if you're inclined to go there. But we just want to be sure that before you start voting on anything, you understand what it is you're voting for. I'll take a pause there, and then I'll get into the actual voting process.
Okay, I have a question first, actually, because I was not at the last meeting at the October 27th, the Vienna Halloween parade, so I apologize for not being here. But the transportation system redundancy G1, can someone explain that to me a little more?
Sure. So we've actually talked a lot about this metric over the last couple of months. Folks have a lot of ideas what redundancy could mean. And in this case, specifically because there is language in that HB 599 legislation that requires us to look at the ability of the transportation network to deal with emergency evacuations. It was specifically written around homeland security type evacuations, but other causes could be incorporated as well. So what we're looking at is the ability of that multimodal transportation network to absorb a shock, right? To absorb a bunch of extra demand. So the way we're planning to calculate that, and the way it's been calculated in years past, is to essentially take the peak hour demand, which in our region happens to be 5 to 16, just perfectly timed for us all to try and get here, and essentially throw 10% extra demand at the system to see how it does. So in a system where we have some extra capacity and we have that redundancy, it will fare better than in a version of the system where we have no extra capacity and nowhere for those extra folks to go.
Thank you. Yeah, that helps. Okay, any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
Where do I get that short?
Remember Barbie? Oh, you did not get one of these. Okay. I think she came in late. At the last moment.
Wait, it's the peak hour.
No, okay, does everyone else have this? sheet, okay, and you'd like us to start filling them in. Well, I think we're gonna, well, wait, discuss too, is Supervisor Alcorn, did you have a question?
I did. So just so I understand, actually, I've been through a trial on it, so I cheated a little bit. But so this, we should be thinking about these prioritization in terms of future allocation of transportation resources, right? So within the context of Nbta, right?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay, right, because I mean, one of the things that's a little confusing for some of us that deal with land use issues and other things. Here we're looking at basically Nbta's mission, new money basically, or future money
Correct.
right?
That's reasonable, yeah.
Okay, because I mean, that's helped me a little bit sort of piece things out.
And you're right, there's no land use sort of
Right.
stuff that would be judged by.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Councilmember Frederick.
Redundantly asked again. So we have 3 committees that are weighing in on this and other groups that are weighing in on this as well, or our 3 committees are going to make the final recommendations for these weightings.
3 committees, this one, technical advisory committee, and those 2 committees are statutory required for Nbta, and then we have a standing committee, which is the planning and programming committee, which is comprised of 5 members of the authority put in a committee format. And then each committee is independently coming up with filling out this. We will report each committee's recommendations separately to the authority, but to make the authority's decision a little bit easier, or at least to give them a starting point, we're going to average the 3 committees, treating each committee as equal with each other. And then at the end of that averaging process, which we'll report that average, and then in addition to the average, we will report and most likely recommend a rounded version of the average version, where we basically move everything to the nearest 5% up or down, making sure that it still adds up to 100. And the reason we do that is because it doesn't actually substantively change the outcome if you move something a couple of points up or down. But it does make it a lot easier to explain it to a lay audience versus, a weighting of 2.75 and another one of 11.9. It's impossible to remember, for one thing, for us and for the public. We think that we hope it's lost. So we tend to round things. Now, obviously, with 10 measures, and you're throwing 100%, 100 points at those. Yeah, and then averaging and smoothing, things are kind of going to begin to merge towards something that looks like 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10. And that's fine as well. I mean, we could probably realistically anticipate that might be an outcome, but we could never presume that. And if any committee wants to throw much more weight on a smaller number of measures, to the expense of other measures, that's fine too. I would say that Nbta staff, and indeed your staff, are not casting votes on this because we consider it to be a policy direction. So it's really for you to tell us. We're not, technically there's no correct answer here. It is a policy direction we're looking for. And if the direction is 10, 10, 10, 10, 10.
Well, I do need to chime in because our priority is congestion reduction. So at the end of the day, the congestion reduction performance measure should have the highest weight. And I think we have 6 performance measures that are specifically targeted at congestion reduction. So in order to keep us at a place where the attorneys feel comfortable in the event we are challenged and making sure that we are consistent with the law, the congestion reduction performance measures specifically should have the highest total weight.
And just to expand on that point, Haroon is just putting the spreadsheet up so you can see this. We consider, and then this is consistent with what has been done previously with with HB 599, right here, there are 6 performance measures that most closely align with that mandate on congestion reduction. And these are A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, and G1. So so it's basically the first 5 on your sheet, looking at the column headings, and the last column heading are the 6 performance measures, which when we add those up, you know, we and the councils will be wanting to be sure that that is not that's at least a plurality, if not a majority. Having said that, you know, there is a lot of overlap between the performance measures. I mean, some that will address congestion does not necessarily make them a highway kind of focus, because the way we do our evaluation, transit projects, if they cause people to switch modes, will reduce congestion as well. So it doesn't necessarily favor one mode of project over another mode of project, but it does focus on congestion. You know, in the focus, and in a bizarre kind of way, you know, a safety project or a project that's, you know, specifically focused on safety would obviously be important, but, you know, if the majority of the vote, or, you know, the majority of the weight fell on safety, that would actually probably cause a bit of a legal problem for us, because, you know, that's not the priority for Nbta. In any case, we anticipate that any product that's submitted to us will be designed consistent with our core value, will be designed and implemented in a fashion that would itself be safe, and the product of that project would improve safety anyway. It's almost a given that we would not fund something that was believed to be inherently unsafe.
That's good. Yeah, makes sense. Sorry. I'm sorry, can I ask for one more? B2, what exactly, can that be explained a little further?
Which one are you asking for?
B2, transit person miles and dedicated priority road.
Sure. So this would look at transit travel in a priority or dedicated right of way, which is what the page says. So think of this as, on the high end is dedicated right of way, which would be on Metro Rail, on VRE, in dedicated lanes for BRT, so like Metroway in Arlington and Alexandria. But we also want to give some credit to projects that might be putting people in less dedicated but prioritized as well. So places we might be putting in queue jump lanes at intersections, transit signal priority, anything that's giving the transit vehicles a way around some of the congestion. And so we're quantifying that by thinking about the number of passenger miles that are in those dedicated or prioritized right-of-ways.
Okay, Supervisor Alcorn.
Does that include HOV link?
That is a good question.
I know, we talked about that before.
That is a good question, and one that I think we haven't quite finalized based on the new footnote that was added to these.
Right.
Correct, yeah.
It can.
I mean, certainly any project that incorporates an HOV facility will get credit for the fact that the vehicle occupancy is more than one, and the higher it is, the more credit it will essentially get. So it will be incorporated. There's still a bit of a question that the footnote to the table down now said that transit may include high occupancy vehicles, but you know, in terms of the way the model approaches high occupancy vehicle lanes, they tend to be treated as a highway mode rather than as a transit mode. But we understand the intent behind the note that was added, and you know, as appropriate, to the particular situation, it will capture. I would say if there are no HOV projects that are included in the transaction project list, then it doesn't really matter if 50% of the weight is associated with HOV. If there are no projects there, then 0 is still going to be 0. So, I mean, and that's the point I've made with all the committees and with the authorities is the performance measures and the weights are important, but so too are the projects that they are being applied to. If the projects aren't there, then we could have the most academically beautiful set of performance measures and weights, but it would make no difference if the projects are not there in the list.
Yeah, it's really difficult. Yes, difficult, maybe not a good question to ask. So if it includes signal prioritization and the project's putting in like 3 signals, how many miles is that?
So that's something we also have to quantify.
Okay, that's fine.
Is looking at that is how much the distance is actually prioritized. And then we also are thinking about, the passenger miles in fully dedicated right-of-way should probably be weighted a little bit more heavily than the ones that are only partially prioritized. So you're gonna work it out.
Yeah, it's good. I was just kind of curious how you were dealing with that. That's fine. Let me know when you come decide.
And just to Dahlia's point, we won't just work it out. We'll make sure that your staff know what we're doing and keep them fully appraised of the methodology as we go. There are some things until we get a bit further into it, we can't quite finalize the methodology. So there will still be some refinements as we go, but there'll be no shift from the intent behind these performance measures.
Okay, anyone else?
So in terms of the voting, you see here that Vice Mayor Bennett Parker has already provided us with some numbers. So Haroon has pre-populated this spreadsheet, and if you want to fill out the form and give it to us, we can do it that way. If you just want to read them out, we can do it that way. If you want to think about it a little bit longer, you can go last. We can do it however you want to do it. So we just tell us the numbers and whatever.
Well, I mean, should there be some discussion if anybody wants to kind of, I think maybe we should.
Well, let me continue. So we consider this to be your initial statement on how you feel, right? But we don't think you can make a recommendation until you've seen how everyone has voted, see what
Okay. So
see
we
what
want
the
to put
average
those
is
up
looking like
first,
for the committee.
and then discuss.
And then you can discuss that. You can
Okay.
you can override the average if you feel that it doesn't reflect. But
Okay.
that then becomes.
Sorry. So I should fill it out. Yes,
So
right.
this is just a starting point.
Okay. That was fun.
I appreciate it. I
There's always that one person.
That's how it turned, isn't it?
Easier with a mask.
That's why it doesn't have to go back.
That's fine. Just make sure you touch.
Mine too. That's why I have a way better
That's back.
Because I really want to prioritize lack of decreasing congestion by increasing opportunities for people to bike and walk and take.
200
public
switches.
transportation.
There's potential for transcription errors.
And this will decrease
The
congestion.
good thing is that there's a check on the road, so.
Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah. Put in a compensating error.
Well, I think you have to.
Two errors that cast themselves out. That may be harder to see.
So there's no bus from Percival to Leesburg? Yeah, that's gotta increase.
I think sort of. I think mistake.
Okay. 5. 5. 10.
Well, then you need to figure out a place that you don't mind having that. You know.
That's up to 100. All right.
Now we're up to 100, right?
Yeah, well. But you have to represent Percival because you have such an outlier, right? I mean, I at least have one of those town that has a similar demographic. Here you are. Some people can't bike. You have a really good access to that. We have to bike to Leesburg and get on those trains. Yeah, apparently they fly. It's like a highway. Stand up.
Changed a little bit.
Yeah, I like that. That's gonna be really dangerous.
Yeah.
I saw 2 people doing that at church, and I'm like, this is dangerous. Or they were wearing helmets, but I would think you need body armor.
Have you gotten the information?
Yeah, and you have to get them in, yeah. And then I'll ask you.
I'm sure she's heard a lot about it.
I hope you can read my writing. I kind of scribbled over things. Yeah, I was very,
We didn't even look, we didn't see. I figured the congestion was. Yeah, the reduced congestion was the most important. It's like that, say,
is there unincorporated land outside there? I just feel like that's reality. No, I'm not saying you need anything, but transportation.
Just put it in the chat.
Well, see, that's what we're trying to do.
You got your people.
Property that
reliable bus service.
Build the roads.
Then they're not gonna go hard. And, but people don't have the conversations. We have that conversation. But all of them have more holistically this conversation. You know,
The new highway.
So I think we can actually.
Intercounty connector. Collector, what do you call it? Intercounty connector.
The one for Maryland?
No. This is one in Percival.
It's been happening a lot. It's been months. We didn't get to get out of the meeting on time. There has been a lot of conversation now. I was gonna say, it's like,
Take some congestion out. That's been-
we had an opinion to have more. I'm gonna stop talking to you when you're done. One of the things that I told Chantel next year, I don't even know we can go back. I want 40% of you to get
Everybody listening to our conversation.
I agree.
You guys are doing virtual still? Then that CPB is, yeah.
Yeah, some of the big organizations.
DC has not allowed us to come in, yeah, person.
The Council of Governments.
Am I supposed to submit my numbers? I haven't.
Yes,
done
you
that
are.
yet.
Oh, sorry.
You're over here chatting.
And is there any way to make that screen a height? Say a little bigger.
I don't know things. How are you?
I can't really see that very well.
For some reason, I don't know what I was thinking, but I put it under banks and I'm actually.
I like how you're thinking, Pam. I got two.
I'm hoping that ours should not be that much different. That should be the bigger problem. There are parts of vastly different. across the
Yeah, you got a problem.
Because your people are pretty much going the same direction my people are.
Yeah.
It's a whole lot of-
Make sure you don't overrun.
Oh, okay.
I can't read the names. I can't even read the numbers.
Unless it's super on the front.
You could roll that one closer.
We don't scatter around, you know, like an old tiny radio.
Libby and I could have had a conversation anytime. I didn't realize that we know my number. I didn't realize you had to. I know. No, I'm just going. Sure. Will we get a copy of this once all the numbers are in? Because I'd be curious to look at it. I mean, we may, from here, I can't do that. We'll try and get it.
Well, the ones with the app,
Oh, so.
because that's what we know.
So nice to get to see that in hand. Well, that, yeah, last year we did two through the eighth,
That's what they're trying
which actually was during COVID, it was really fun. 4 hours. Right. And we all rode our cars.
At the moment.
I made, because they break the council.
Okay, oh, I saw it at the end. Okay.
Nobody wants to look at it. Hold it for a couple of years.
Oh,
On his trip, down a trip, and he said, you know what, but no.
Did we ask the parking lot?
No, we got the Christmas parade, that's it.
Oh, yeah, you have a Christmas break, right? I think some towns, cities that.
We all meet up at the
Christmas.
in the community center, we have a lot of Christmas.
Well, it's better than
Oh.
driving that way every day, which is really crazy. I had a man who took care of. That's a little different.
Mhm.
Yeah, people are.
We haven't had any-
We had a, I don't know if you were. But storage period, you know, we made it look.
Well, that should have been the thing we did all along. So
And
I'm
it's
glad
all
something's
around
forcing us to do it.
Church.
But I just weren't.
Monday, I was
obviously.
we just had it, Santa comes, and, you know, I like. Yeah, we bring Santa in on the very. Oh, we bring Santa in on the.
Look at that.
Yeah, we-
That's a whole nother level there.
I know. I like the Christmas tree. Bring Santa on the very.
We're gonna have to top you guys right next door.
You
got a VRE too.
Well, that's true.
He's gotta have a Christmas tree right by the very. What do you have to do? But it's
So glad he's not working in an office.
Yeah, really.
And then we, they have a big like, truck for a big ride, they put him and the kids and Mrs. Claus. Band plays in high school and marches over to the museum where we have stage. And then the choir sings and the kids sing.
I thought I might skip mine and go to Manassas.
That would not go well over the music.
Yeah, it was my perfect.
There's a lot of things, but not that one. You have a job.
Somehow there's a issue with you. December should be 10.2.
Right.
What's
So
the
we
formula
have
on
a
that?
police officer.
That's the formula here. I was in, police officer in King County, Washington. So this is deviation. Yeah.
Oh,
It should be different. It should be all right, right?
You and my phone would be like, look.
No way.
Really thanks.
He was on a boomer.
Gonna see,
It's on which
see if I can get it, if it works.
USS Georgia.
How many people are there?
I
know, I was the last person on the bottom.
All right, just don't post it on Facebook, Pam.
Yeah, never know.
I just have to be able to pressure. Yeah.
Yeah, it did work, I mean,
Yeah.
That was, we were there in
That was
the 80s.
13 years, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, we probably walked past each other. Really?
There's a formula. There's something wrong in here.
And it's interesting.
No, she just goes from one to the next.
They have these big numbers on my computer.
Some of our staff work together.
But 20 points for that.
Because it gets its stuff. Yes, a lot of things. And so you can then, those things that you like.
You think you put it right now?
Yeah, because I'm just doing arithmetic average. It shows the average here.
That was it.
Yeah, checking that with.
Oh, the USS
It just seems that we're reducing congestion, the way we're gonna reduce.
Excellent, I think that-
I think that congestion is the way to be bigger.
No, because that's road building.
And that's just getting all the road building.
This is where the inner doesn't understand the outer. No, no, because buses, so buses reduce it.
Yeah.
Right, but if I don't have roads to put the buses on and I don't have single occupancy vehicles being able to get there, then we'll get to 20 into prime example of that.
Right, but the project, yeah, so the project then would be create more buses.
I don't have a bus lane.
So then we lose forget about that.
You see what I'm saying?
So
No, but I'm saying
therefore,
that the
roads.
property to help the project is you need to make buses go there.
A robot.
You know what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah.
So we're looking at it, reasons to build some other projects that would encourage buses and all
I
this.
know.
But the things we don't reduce congestion. We're looking about emissions on the bus, I get it, I think it's coming out from a very different angle.
It is.
Why is that wrong?
It really is. Everybody I know who lives in Alaska is a pilot. So I think that's one of the things that just happens to you when you live there.
You have to leave.
They just can't leave. No, they love it.
Really?
Nobody wants to leave. Everybody I know. who
So I
lives
check-
there is like,
Check about, we're ready when you are.
Oh, yes, sorry. We are ready. I'm ready. Yeah.
So I just wanted to make sure, just go back up. While we're going through this, just make sure that what we put down against your name is correct. Then you can, just to make sure that you're happy. But in this row here, the too high now.
make it one tiny bit bigger.
Yeah. In the average suggested weight, that's based on the averaging of everything you've given us. Okay, so that's kind of like the initial position. It adds up to 100, and the number to the right of that, 57 point something, that is the number of weights associated with the measures I mentioned earlier: A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, and G1. They're the ones that are most closely aligned with congestion reduction, and with a number of 57.3. I do not believe the attorneys will have to give us any difficulty. So this is all compliant, and so the recommended weight above that average line is blank, and that's basically the number we want to take to, as your recommendation to the authority. What we can do several things. We can just take the numbers in the average row if you're happy with them. If you want to discuss them further and change them, then we can put whatever revision. We just override it and write it straight into the recommended weight line. So we won't change any of the actual polling numbers that you've given us. So we can hand it back to you for discussion.
Okay, thank you. So, Mr. Gus, when you were explaining, you were saying that everything would be rounded to 5, right? To 5, 10, 15, whatever. And so does that mean that quality D1 would round to 15? And I mean, you had mentioned that you said everything was going to be in increments of 5. Does that mean eventually? Not ours.
Will I do the rounding after the averaging of the 3 committees?
Gotcha.
Okay, so you're only looking at yours
Right.
obviously at the moment. So we want to add them all together, add them and average them before we do any rounding. But if say,
you're not gonna round.
looking at what you've got now, if that were the average for 3 committees, then the 10.7 under A1 will go to 10, the 11.8 will go to 10, the 10.2 will go to 10, 7.5 we come back to. And so on, and then the 7.5 will go up or down depending on where the rounding left us. So that might go to 10, it might go to 5. I mean, the interesting thing here, I guess the important thing here is nothing is like around 2, because that would then get rounded to 0, which essentially means this committee has basically removed the performance measure, which again is perfectly acceptable. But that's something we need to consider. But I don't think, based on what I recall from the other committees, we're likely to round anything to 0. So everything would be between 5 and 15.
Don't mean to jump in there, but from my perspective, I was interested in 2 things. One, the numbers that are in row 5 that show the weighted percentage based on the overall space that's there. It makes sense to me that mobility is nearly 40% and that accessibility is over resiliency. That intellectually works for me. So I think we're in the ballpark from a holistic perspective. The note I would share with the group is I think there's a value, and that's why I put it a higher number in this subsection C2 versus C1 that may be worth pursuing and looking at. I think that the way those performance measures are set up, that looking at weighting C2 higher than C1 in some fashion may be a policy statement worth making for this group based on where we're at. So that would be the advice I would share. I'm not surprised that most of them feed up there, but that'd be the one suggestion I would add. Mr. Jasper, I don't know what an appropriate way to do as you're looking for 5s at the end, but I think that's an area where if the committee felt strongly, I would advocating for an 11 or 12 in C2 and moving C1 down the similar amount or playing with that number there, because I think that's a good policy statement to make. Outside of that, I have no further suggestions.
An 11 or 12 actually only gets to a 10, so right when it gets all average, or it gets average with everything else. So
That was where I was looking for some help to what number to put it at to make it a policy number.
I mean, I think if you were to make that change as a committee, then you have made that policy statement. However, it ends up with the rounding, that statement has been made. And I think what you're really referring to there, just to make sure I'm fully understanding, is that because C2 is like the equity equivalent of C1, it's basically to what the right word is, but really emphasizing the importance of accessibility for the economically disadvantaged groups.
Correct. I don't think we lose much by adding more to C2. That if you need to take it from C1, I would want us to emphasize C2 because I think it encompasses C1 more. So I would suggest that push from our committee.
Right. Well, we could certainly, when we report these out, if there are those sorts of policy statements you want to make, we can actually specifically include them in the report.
Can I just leave upon your words and put you on the spot? When you say EEA is economically challenged?
I'm sorry. It's the equity emphasis areas.
Right, so we're not just talking about people who are economically
Correct.
vulnerable. It could be people who are disabled or elderly or something like that, who are
Yes.
difficult. Okay.
Yeah. I used economically there because it was to do with access to jobs. But yeah, I mean, the equity emphasis areas is my call.
Sorry to.
No, good question.
So I support Mr. Staley's suggestion. I think he's right. Yeah.
Combine the two.
I mean, I do think that it's important for everybody to take alternative modes of transportation, but people who need it the most.
Right. So an example, let's think of an example and how it would work and would you like it? I mean, obviously we want, can you give an example?
Sure. So based on what I heard here, my proposal would be to put a 15 in H6 and a 5 in G6 to
Right.
emphasize that
Give
area.
an example of that. That would be.
UNC, not X1 or H. There's no H. You went C1 and C2?
I'm sorry, I was using the row columns up there, C2.
Right.
I live in Excel land. I work for a data company, so I live in Excel land all day long. My apologies there. So my example would be a area that focused on accessibility by in an EEA area would, I think, inherently also improve areas around it because of the jurisdiction. And so by focusing, are you thinking about an EEA area first? I think your byproduct of that is the other area. So I think by emphasizing it, you are actually encouraging the behavior without detrimentally harming the area. So if my neighborhood borders an economically issued area, I'm going to likely benefit from it as well, but we're focusing first on that economically, the EEA area first. I think we'll have a byproduct. I think that is a simple statement to make without screwing up the overall case.
So you're handling the C's of one.
Correct.
They both add up to something.
And so putting
Put the weight on it. Yep.
the weight on one of them, 15.5, I think is a simple way to do it.
Right, so I mean, it just so I can expand on that then. So these two here are approximately adding up to 20, it's actually closer to 22. And what Councilmember Steele is saying is rather than go with that, go with 5 and 15. It still adds up to about the same number. You could make that 6 and 16, make it more precise. So it wouldn't affect any of these other scores. It would just redistribute the scores between these two measures. We wouldn't combine them. We keep them separate, but we'd redistribute the weight. That is what I understand you're proposing.
Okay, what does everybody think about that? Thumbs up or hands up that would like
So
that?
can I just ask?
Yes, please do.
I'm not sure,
Please do.
I think I agree with what you're doing,
Right,
but just consider a proposal.
right.
Equity emphasis area is not exclusively economic,
Right, that's
It's
what we
other
were
things
talking
too.
about, right?
but it's, economics is a component of it, right? So the projects that would be competing would be a project to, enhance access to transit in a upscale affluent area where we're going to $5, bicycle, and another project, which would be in an economically disadvantaged area where we're trying to encourage the same thing. I guess I don't object, obviously, to helping people who need more help, but I want to encourage everybody,
Yeah, no, that's true.
regardless of their economics.
Right,
I mean,
exactly.
almost,
Right.
it's almost more difficult to get people, I'm just thinking about Falls Church, to get out of their cars when they have a big fine car and a garage and all that. Those are the kind of people that I really want to ride in that car because they frankly have a little more leeway inside their schedule and they can access transit. So So if I weight it the way that's being suggested, basically the economically disadvantaged area is at an advantage over area which is more upscale. Is that right? I mean, am I reading that right?
No, that's how I would look at it too. I understand what you're saying. I
I'm sorry, can I
think, yes, please.
insert just a couple of technical clarifications. The first is, yes, I believe you're correct. C1 is looking at helping everybody from the perspective of access, and C2 is really focusing on, as you say, right, helping those who need more help, essentially. From a technical perspective, I do want to point out that both of these measures are looking at access by all modes, not just transit. So accessibility in a car, thinking about how far you can get in a certain amount of time, is also included in this measure. So it could be looking at things that are decreasing congestion and they're by helping you get further in a car in a given amount of time in those historically underserved areas as well. So we can think about that. There's also bike connectivity, bike accessibility to jobs baked in there as well. So I just want to be clear, it's not just transit. It is.
Okay, that's helpful to know. So if I could just finish my thought, I don't know how to vote for sure. But basically, I would want to encourage probably the equity emphasis area project because people there don't really have a choice about how they get around. They've probably got to get around by train, or more likely not to have a personal vehicle.
I mean, in some instances, yes, they are unlikely to have personal vehicles. I think it may have been Monica who was talking about this at our last meeting, that the truly poor folks in our region are, what was it, Monica, you had the.
So according to COG's regional travel study or survey,
Household travel survey.
the severe low income, and they classify that as making $25,000 or less, they're 3 times as likely or more likely to drive.
Yeah, well, that's
So the suburbanization of poverty and things like that has actually changed how that actually functions.
the only way to get to 3 jobs is to have a vehicle that's driving at all, and you can't ride a bus with 3 different locations. Okay, well, thanks for.
My specific comment was that, yes,
Thank you. I appreciate that. So along the same conversation, those people who are more economically disadvantaged by car, they're going to be in under number D. They're going to be trying to, where we want to try to reduce their dependency on driving alone. That's, I like to use the example of 28. 28, even if the Godwin extension goes through at some point, it will never have a bus lane. So those people that live in some of the poorest communities in Northern Virginia, they have to get 5 miles to the first bus to get the bus that's going to take them to Vienna, or the bus that's going to take them to Reston. They can't do that at 5 o'clock in the morning to get there if you're a maintenance person, if you're a hospitality worker. And the way those buses run, and then when they come back, how are they getting back home? It's not even just a last mile issue, it's several mile issue. So, though I completely understand where you're coming from, the access to improving access to jobs is very important, but the type of jobs and the things we're talking about really are dependent on us thinking both the needs of our inner jurisdictions and our outer jurisdictions. Those of us that live in outer jurisdictions our people don't have the kind of access to public transportation, but yet we probably have, I would be willing to bet, far more economically challenged, both in senior citizens as well as others, than most of the inner regions that have the access to that. So if we don't do something to decrease the dependence on driving by building maps and roads to help them get there through bus transportation or other ways, that doesn't change. And you still have these people in single occupancy vehicles trying to get through to go to the inner jobs. So access to jobs, yes, but it's not really going to matter if they don't have a way to get there. That's just, I wanted to.
So you like the 515?
Yeah. So the 515, I'm just pointing this out. I'm not saying I don't agree with you, but from what it sounds like, if the project was in an EE population, they could potentially get 20 points. because they would be getting points from the first column and the second. Why wouldn't they get for that too, right? So they could get up to 20, and then we're saying, okay, then if they're not in a PEA population, really the most that you can get would be 5. So that's, it's really not 15 and 5, it's now 20. I'm just pointing that out. So that's, you're only getting, you know. Supervisor.
That adds up to 20. What do we do with the 1.7?
Oh, I think, yeah, I think
Does
we,
it get averaged across the?
right,
rest?
exactly. How would we do it?
So
That's a good point.
I'd like to put it for emissions. The one that we hated the most, vehicle emissions. Because that's a proxy for so many different things. Vehicle emissions handles, it does do the congestion and everything, and that it's, it's the air, actual federal funding is actually based on emissions, so it kind of handles that. It handles congestion, it handles equity in many ways, because the people who suffer most from emissions are folks that don't have a whole lot of money, sustainable, and it encourages people to be doing different things other than single occupancy. So that's part of the reason we just found that was proxy for a lot of different things. So I'd love it if it's a few extra digits, we go ahead over that way. One head not over here, but on the
Well, when I first looked at this, I thought, why are the emissions so much lower? I mean, I voted lower on it, but I didn't vote a lot lower. Because right now, if you look at the climate conference and all those other things, we need to make sure that we are thinking about the environment with every decision we make. And I know this isn't about, controlling vehicle emissions, but it is about controlling a population of vehicle emissions.
It also is good for electric vehicles, which we absolutely need to get going.
The explanation I heard for that is that actually driving a single occupancy vehicle at 55 miles an hour is a fairly emissions friendly activity compared to slower speeds. So if you're going to put an emphasis on vehicle emissions, opens the door to more highway construction. So single occupancy vehicles can go 50, 55 miles an hour. And some people would think that's a good idea, and some people don't want that. That's the explanation.
Yeah, that's sort of, I think, looking to the future, I think we're going to be looking at electric vehicles. So this charging infrastructure we need to get people on buses and transit. So I can see that argument, but I think there's so many arguments that weigh it over the other way in the direction we go with climate and everything else that it helps. So I'm just arguing just if they're just a few extra digits to just kind of toss them in there, because it's a proxy for a lot of different things.
And I think we need to remember that the whole, it's interesting because this has changed a lot since we voted. We had these measures in 2017, that was the last time, right? That we did this. But, the real focus is on congestion. Of course, if cars are sitting in traffic, that's a lot of pollution too. So,
exactly. That's why I think it's so many
right.
different
So
things.
as you can see, my weights are way more in the, ABC group there. Just because I think, knowing that this is really the main, I think, goal of this group, but I think they're all certainly valuable goals. I would tend to go that way. I would tend to move them back up to the.
If we want to get to more sustainability and things, I think the climate could use a few digits, maybe a little bit more. So I see where you're coming from.
I agree, because
agree.
if you reduce the congestion as a consequence, you'll reduce the vehicle emission.
You will, and if you do electric vehicles, you also will. That's what I'm saying, it's a proxy for so many.
Which is correct. And it'll be, and that's a free market decision for all of us. And we will make when there's more options. We have the infrastructure to point out. But I think that to support the reduction in congestion would have a then benefited vehicle emission.
Yes, Councilmember Steve.
Thank you. So I apologies for taking us down to gravel. My initial statement was to try and keep the numbers in the buckets the same. And so when you move 5 and 15, my recommendation would be to preserve that 35. You would actually dump the remainder to the 13.6 to keep it within the parameter of what is those 3 measures. in there, which is the accessibility measure. So that was where my head was at. I totally understand what you're
I'm just
trying.
borrowing from your bucket.
I know you were. So I just wanted to be clear. That was not my intent. My intent was to keep them within the buckets they were as people are doing. I totally respect what folks are doing, but that was where my head was at. So that by default, to answer your question, Supervisor Arcon, any remainder would go to the 13.6 to end it where we want. And if you wanted to reallocate within the buckets, as you have 40.2 across the mobility bucket and 24.5 across it, I would be very fine, because I think that's what we naturally came up with to make them actually a policy statement. So if you wanted to shake it that way, that was where my head was at, but that's just one person's suggestion.
Well, if we put it in the fourth column with the 7.5 is right in between 5 and 10. We could put it in the fourth column there, and that would add 1.7. That would, if that did end up, averaging to an increment of 5, that would go to 10. I mean, that is one of our biggest goals, I think. Or I thought that was the point.
If I may, we already know the emphasis is on congestion. We already know this is part of why I didn't give it as much emphasis. The first 4 categories are given. There's really no question about that. So I really wanted to focus on the stuff that burnished and made them shine. The emissions thing is really important. The access to all kinds of transportation is really important. But we all know that the congestion thing is the main thing. So we're not that we're taking anything away from that, because that's the main thing.
Is that okay? And I'll just say it's a good point. I mean, this is because of the legislation. We got to follow it. But that legislation was put in by people who we're not so crazy about doing electric vehicles. We're not so crazy about doing bike paths. We're not, it's a way you've already been shaped by some policy that I don't know that this region actually supports as much. So going for the vehicle emissions seemed a way to kind of just push it over a little bit more the way the region would like to go. So.
Madam Chair, if I could, I would like to know the authority we funded electric buses, the infrastructure that goes with buses. We funded trails. We are truly multimodal. Now, I understand the conversations regarding vehicle emissions and making sure, but we have to make sure those type of projects, even electric vehicles, that we can directly relate them to congestion reduction. And I say that because I've gotten questions, hey, can you fund replacement of our city or county fleet? Well, those are replacements, but I will say we have been fortunate enough to be in a position where we can state that we are truly multimodal in the types of projects that we fund. And getting back to something what Keith said earlier, because the legislation also calls out long-term benefits, which over time, every locality has to get their proportional share of benefits for the revenues, and I'm paraphrasing. We also make sure that at the end of the day, and to this day, I think the only locality that's under is Arlington.
Yeah, we're aware.
We have a funding program we're doing now, and so you'll probably be over if, However, I want to note that there are various aspects of the law we have to make sure that we're following. Even in our enabling legislation, it talks about safety, it talks about the environment, even though we have to give priority to congestion reduction. And that's the attorneys noted that they want to see something quantifiable in the case that we are challenged in that. But we have to give priority to and document that we give priority to, but it has to be priority to the projects that have the greatest level of congestion reduction relative to cost. So I know I'm switching over to the 6-year funding program a bit, but I do want to put that out there because we've been in a position, we funded the WOND trail, we funded roundabouts, we funded electric buses and the infrastructure that goes with that. And I bring this up now because with the new administration coming in, I get questions about that. Oh, those projects don't score well. Yeah, they do. They compete with the same model that all the projects are evaluated the same way and they do relatively well. So I did want to note that.
Thank you. I had your hand up. Okay, anyone else? Okay, so that looks like this We are waiting. Let's take a vote. Are we ready to vote, or do we have other questions?
Can I try for just, is there any interest in putting a little more vehicle emissions? I'm not gonna, if there's any interest, then we'll play with it, but if there's not any interest in doing it, then I won't bother. Because that would be one separate vote we could do before we put it on the whole thing.
I mean, to me, that's a 10 already. That seems pretty
You know,
high.
well, we did it at 25, so you can see that.
Yeah.
So just, if there's not any interest, I'm not seeing a whole bunch of interest. I'm not gonna go. I've seen
I think
something
it
that's-
balances out though, because I think we had 25 or 30 for A and that. They're all.
Oh,
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, no,
right. I mean, they do
One
help
second.
each other out. Is there someone participating electronically that would like to speak?
Thank you.
Hello, is this, Franklin?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Ms. Franklin, would you like to speak? Supervisor Franklin?
No, thank you.
Okay, all right. We just saw that you were on. We're glad you're on. We just didn't know if you had anything to say. Okay, thank you. Yes. Councilmember
I
Seeley.
just want to make sure I know what we're voting on. So are we then taking all the scores that are in row 7 and moving them up to row 6? Is that the action that is on the table? I was looking for Mr. Jasper. I just wanted to make sure I was tracking with what.
Maybe someone can give us those numbers, because I don't know.
Yeah, thank you for asking. I'm not clear either at this stage. So we've made an adjustment to C1 and C2, but it doesn't completely cover the number of points that the 10.8 and 10.9. So either the 15 and the 5 need to go up a little bit, or you need to put those points somewhere else.
So based on what I heard the group, my recommendation would be to just move them up to whatever you need to average them out a little more, so that you've got the split, and that way we don't mess with any other ones. So I'm happy to suggest that if we're gonna go, if A1 is going to be 10.7, which I think is what is on the table, then my recommendation would be to make C1, I believe it would be 5.8, and C2 15.9, which I think gets you the points back, if I'm doing math in my head correctly. Which is always very scary to try and do.
And it would be copying everything else.
And then everything else would just copy.
Fair.
You just got the group to go along with your waiting.
I was just.
You good.
And just type in the scores.
No, I get you.
Just
Okay.
Don't copy, because you'll copy from the. Just listen.
Yeah, this will box up the spreadsheet. It only gives you what is below it, right? So
Right.
you've got to change what's below it. So
Okay, we're at 100. Okay, so I think unless anyone else has any further questions, comments, suggestions, what we're voting on is what you see in red.
I can try to figure out what we're at.
Madam Chairman, I will say, okay, is there a second? Okay, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say nay.
Aye.
Aye.
All right, that passes. Excellent. Good work, everybody. Okay, so we are now at okay, Mr. Jasper, are we finished with that part now, or did you have anything else you wanted to add?
We have finished. Thank you very much. Let me just place a record. We've been working at this. And we really appreciate your diligence, your perseverance, and kind of taking this to the finishing line. We know it's get here, and we really appreciate it.
So everybody's had great comments, a great job. Changed the meeting for some of us today, and I appreciate that. So it was a big meeting, and it's obvious that this is important to all of us. So, okay, the next thing on the agenda is transaction scenario definitions.
Right, he usually gives me an introduction here, but I can probably do it without him.
He's a little busy right now.
Okay, you all right with that? Cool. Just keep working on what you're doing. Okay, scenario analysis. We've talked very briefly about this before, that how in addition to looking at sort of what we call a standard future forecast for the region, which incorporates not only the regional cooperative land use forecasts for Northern Virginia and the rest of the region, but also looks at the projects that are already included in the CLRP, but is based on a modeling set that assumes that the travel patterns of the last 20 years are going to stay roughly the same. People are going to make decisions in the same way as they have. I think if the last year and a half has taught us anything, is that we have to be prepared to deal with that uncertainty. I assume we all agree with that one. So one of the things that Nbta likes to do as part of this process is incorporate some what-if scenarios, some alternatives to what I keep referring to as the standard future, but that more standard forecast. So these are plausible potential futures, but they're not necessarily preferred potential futures. We're not trying to design an ideal future here. We're not necessarily even saying these are the most likely scenarios, but we're trying to use them to sort of to understand what might happen if. And so we use assumption-based scenarios to do that. So we make a lot of assumptions about how the future will change. We will be wrong. I'm going to state that right now. We're only doing 4 scenarios. We could do 100 and still be wrong in all of the details. But again, what we're looking for here is some understanding directionally about what might change and how travel patterns might change, so that we can understand, so that Nbta can understand what projects would still be good investments and if there are any things out there that, you know, if something big changes, we don't really need to invest in that anymore. So we call that avoiding investment obsolescence. And that's really what we're trying to do here. So we've thought about 4 scenarios. You guys have heard these names before. I think we had 1 whole slide to share the last time we talked about these. Now we have 4 whole slides. So you see, we've grown exponentially. And we'll continue to do that. But I want to talk briefly a little bit through what we're thinking with at least these 4 scenarios in broad picture terms. If you guys have any thoughts, comments, concerns about these, we're happy to hear them. This will not be, unfortunately, the last time I come to talk to you about these. So you will hear them again. Unfortunately for you, not for me. I should make that clear. So let's talk about these a little bit. The first scenario on the next slide, we're calling the post-pandemic new normal, which we of course have to do this year, assuming we get to a post-pandemic. And really what this scenario would be focused on is what are some of these trends that we've been observing over the last year and a half really continue into the long-term future. And we are talking very long-term, right? 2045 is a long way away. Who knows what's going to happen? But thinking of if this level of telework continues to be commonplace into the long-term future, if school shifts, particularly at the university level, to virtual, if we see the continued online shopping and the deliveries that come with that, what does that do? We've also seen changes in willingness to use public transit, right? It's changed over the course of the pandemic as we've learned more about the disease itself. But what does that continue to look like into the future? There's also the potential for major changes to land use, which is not something Nbta typically looks at, because as we've discussed, land use is not in, Nbta has no authority there. However, thinking about a new normal, there are major land use. We can think about the office market, which has been very volatile over the last year. If all of this continues, does that volatility continue to places that have typically been jobs hubs, start to transition to more residential or more other uses? These are questions that nobody really knows the answers to, but that we can make some assumptions about. We've also, you guys have all probably seen the stories about how New York and San Francisco emptied out during the pandemic because nobody needed to be there anymore. So why would they pay the rent to live there? That could happen in a larger scale. Why would people choose to live in the downtown area if they don't have to get to that downtown area? So these are all sort of land use questions that we don't know the answers to, but we might want to think about what would happen if. And of course, all of that comes with changes to vehicle ownership, changes in sort of pedestrian and bike travel around the region, all of those things. So one of the big questions we're trying to get an answer to is, would we be comfortable thinking about those potential changes in land use as part of this scenario, knowing it's only a what if, or is that somewhere we don't really feel comfortable going? So open for discussion on that or anything else on this side.
Supervisor Alcorn?
Well, go ahead.
Oh, please, yeah, no. I would think that's something that we're looking at now. It's a reality of offices not being able to bring in businesses because people are working at home. You know, what in my area we have a lot of IT industry there, and you know, people are able to work in their homes, and you know, they may go to their office once a week, or you know, if there's a meeting that they have to go to. So that is a reality for certain industries that may continue.
No, good point, good point. I mean, it could be a little early for us to be, you know, what's gonna happen. I don't know. We know, none of us really know. Is this gonna really be the trend, or is it gonna kind of, you know, I think it's a little early.
We don't know and
Right.
that's why they're what ifs.
Right, exactly. Anyone else? Yeah, go ahead. Did you want to finish?
I was just going to say that, what is it called? The word, like the work, I mean, the workload that they're doing at home, it seems like it's just as much as they're, you know, that's getting done at home as well as at work. So if companies don't have to pay for, you know, office space, then they're cutting their costs. So, I mean,
I'm sure a lot of them.
yeah.
Supervisor Alcorn?
Yeah, I think this is these are really good questions. Obviously, in any scenario, you're looking at a range of different assumptions that go in. And I would want to make sure that in looking at these scenarios, maybe there needs to be some shifting, but the granularity needs to be, and obviously I know it is, and whenever it needs to be much more granular. When you're talking about percent of telework, you know, there is a big difference between, you know, the consumer market, or sorry, the commuter market, and, you know, the local traffic. And, you know, the retail market. So, and, you know, we're all seeing commuter trips are way down, but everything else is back where it was.
Yeah.
And is that going to be that way in 5 or 10 years? Well, maybe not, but maybe it's going to be more like that than it would have been if we did not have it. And so I guess the other thing is your question, should we assume long-term aversion to shared rides transit? No, I don't think. I would, if you look at the type of transit, I mean, in Fairfax County, our bus use is close to where it was pre-pandemic. It's come back quite a bit. Rail ridership, again, is still way down. You know that. But again, a lot of that is the commuter. So you kind of have to, I think, peel back the layers. And same with the office market. Office market near Metro, great. Everywhere else, lousy. So, and we're going to see changes that we don't know what's going to happen. And so I would just encourage being conservative in terms of any major shifts, particularly on the land use side, because the market's going to push this in different directions over the coming years. We
No, both good points, but I agree. We just don't know. It just seems so early.
Yeah, when we talk about office space being dead, I go back to that Yahoo example where they tried to send the entire workforce home, and they found that there was a lack of camaraderie, and that it damaged their company. So I appreciate all these things. I also think that there's no discussion in there about autonomous vehicles, and I know that.
It will be on the next. I love it when you guys do my transition.
Well, before we transition to that, also, I've talked about Germany a bunch, and the last time I was there, we were at, it was the Mercedes show. No, it was in Munich, it was BMW probably. And they were talking about the fact that in Germany, people don't buy that many cars anymore. They share them with each other. Or a company buys a car and rents it out. So I think question of changing to vehicle ownership levels might be something that we need to be concerned about. I don't know that, but Germany is very similar to us in a lot of ways.
Anyone else have comments on this one before we make this wonderful segue to the technology scenario? Okay. So let's take a look at the second one, which is our technology scenario, which focuses on two of the things that we just brought up actually, and is really focused on implementation of connected, automated, shared, and electric vehicles. So the combination of those things, right? The intersection of all of those. So you'll see on this list a lot of technical assumptions that are needed, right? What's the market penetration of these various things by 2045? What's their service area? How much do they cost to own? How much do they cost to operate? All of those fun things there's research on that we will use to populate these. But it really is focused on, can people make that shift from, say, owning their own car in a lot of places to using, we can call it a shared autonomous taxi, a shared autonomous Uber, whatever we want to call that thing in the future. Hopefully I will own them all. That sounds more mentally profitable. But thinking about that in particular. And so two of the questions that we brought up here that you can see on this page, this is another area where changes in the transportation technology and the options available could have an impact on land use. This is very speculative at this point, right? We've heard anecdotally, well, if my car can drive me in and I can sleep while it's driving me in, I might as well live down in Fredericksburg and I can get more rest in while I commute up to DC. But we've also heard if people want to take advantage of these shared automated vehicles, they're going to be more likely to live in denser areas. So while all of this is anecdotal because none of this exists yet, these are, two competing views that may in fact just balance each other out. And we'll have to see. So that's one area that, there's been discussion of land use changes, but we're not entirely convinced that it's necessary for this scenario to understand the technology impact. The other area is related to automating transit, right? And as I think most of you know, the biggest cost in operating transit, particularly buses, is the operator itself, is the labor. And so if you can fully automate buses to the point that you do not need to pay a driver to be on that bus, you could, in theory, for the same amount of transit operating dollars, operate much more service, much more frequent service than you currently do. And so the question there would be is, would we want to see that implemented in this shared autonomous future that we're looking at here? But happy to discuss those questions or anything else anyone wants to talk about.
So, yeah, I agree. I think land use is probably not going to be majorly affected by this. This may affect a lot of things in the transportation system, but probably not that. I would say there may be one thing that's not included here, that it may be 10 years out, even 20 years out. I think it could come. And it gets back to the issue about Route 28 being congested. What are you going to do with buses? Frankly, there's a whole industry that's that's looking to emerge relating to elevated vehicles, basically flying vehicles in transit. And we'll see if the battery technology gets there sooner rather than later, energy storage, and if they can make that happen. But, make sure that as we're testing out these technologies, a lot of these I don't think are going to have much impact on congestion. But if we start seeing technologies like that, that's a game changer. That changes everything.
Supervisor Glass.
Yes, well, I had a question that would there be a land use issue? Because I'm thinking if we have automated vehicles that there may be, lanes where people who would still want it to drive, but there would have to be like one lane for those vehicles that are, that are autonomous. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, so, and that's not so much a land use issue as a lane use issue, I'd say. One letter makes a lot difference. There's like how you would use the roadway. So would we have dedicated roadways for automated vehicles is a very valid question that we want to think about as part of this. The other thing that often gets needed there is pickup drop-off points for passengers, but you also have the opportunity to reduce parking requirements. You don't have to park your car where you're going because it can go to a parking spot somewhere else. It can go pick up its next passenger, whatever that is. So some of that ends up being curb usage kind of stuff. And some of it ends up being, are we dedicating lanes in order to make things move faster? But that's a good point.
Anyone else? Yes.
This doesn't go directly to technology, but it is a scenario that I think we're not considering, which is the change in population and the decrease in and land use is one of those problems that I think we will run into. It takes a lot of space with roads. That leaves less space for dwellings and businesses. So I think in one of these scenarios, we should address populations.
Okay, so that is not, this is not a great segue. So that is not included in any of our scenarios. And part of that is it's something that the authority has talked about before. And in fact, in the last transaction, we talked about potentially, I think we called it a black swan sort of scenario, what if the economy falls apart or in the region falls apart and nobody chooses to live here anymore. And I think the discussion around that is that we thought it to be really unlikely and something everybody would do a lot to avoid, that we didn't actually want to be planning for it. We wanted to be planning to avoid it.
I was actually looking at it the other direction.
Oh, an increase.
Increase in
Yeah.
population.
Increase in population. Okay,
Which is
I'm
almost inevitable.
Okay.
Black swan event of all time has occurred. Yeah, are we going to get off the topic for a second? Are we expecting the region to double in size population-wise in the next 4 years like it is in the last 40?
So the forecast right now by 2045 are looking at an additional, I think it's 25 to 27% growth across Northern Virginia. And that's population and jobs, I believe. So the percentages are lower, but the raw numbers are probably very similar.
That's just Northern Virginia. We know DC, Maryland is always.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that people have always complained about is the plan, when we planned the airports in this area, we didn't plan public transportation at Dallas specific.
May I make a comment?
Mr. Fernandez wants to. Oh, Martinez wants to.
Yes.
Yes. Well,
Please speak.
on some of these assumptions, one of the things we in Leesburg are finding, and there's a particular development that we're working with, that has taken into consideration the change in the business paradigm where people are looking to find places where they can work at home or work remotely. And this whole development is also based in a lot of the population change that are going to need this type of land use as millennials or the generation following the millennials. Their whole idea of the work-play environment has changed, especially due to the remote telecommuting and so forth. So we are actually seeing changes in those kinds of patterns, which also lends that instead of, for example, 2 parking spaces, we're looking at maybe 1 parking space per unit. And we're also looking at the alternative modes of transportation, and this applicant is also looking at that. And, I'm talking about bikes that run on batteries, scooters that run on batteries, and people are wanting to be close to downtown or close to places where they can do things without having to do it in a car. And so we are seeing those kind of land use changes and demands coming that may affect the whole transportation, a whole group of people that are not going to be tied to cars to go anywhere. Just a comment.
No, thank you, Vice Mayor Martinez. Thank you for those comments. Okay, anyone else? Okay.
All right. So scenario number 3 that we're looking at is we're calling this the incentives and pricing scenario. And it comes out of some work that was done by Nbta, finished last year, early this year, the Transportation Technology Strategic Plan, which looked at a number of ways that technologies could be leveraged in the region to reduce congestion and other Nbta goals. And so this would really be looking at implementing a set of transportation pricing and incentive mechanisms to help manage travel demand. So this would include things like free transit to encourage transit use, but also potentially some other incentives to encourage shared rides or to shift travel times. So one example, for those of you who are familiar, COG, before the pandemic, had started a pilot with an app called Incentrip that was designed essentially to incentivize/bribe you to make slightly different travel decisions. So if you were willing to postpone your trip 15 minutes to get out of the peak, there would be sort of rewards points that you could collect for free sandwiches or coffee or whatnot. So something along those lines is what we're thinking there. There could be changes to curbside and parking pricing, right, to accommodate that and to sort of shift demand between modes. But the big sort of pricing piece of this would likely be some sort of roadway pricing structure. So this could be in the form of VMT pricing. It could be in the form of congestion pricing. London has their cordon charge. It could look at something like that as an additional way to help manage that roadway demand. As part of understanding is what could be achieved with something like that from a VMT, from a congestion, from an emissions perspective, if you really put your foot on those potential levers. And so do folks have opinions on not even necessarily which of those pricing schemes might be most politically palatable, but what you might find interesting to learn from as part of this what if scenario? Does a VMT charge sound interesting? Would you be more interested in a cordon pricing scenario? A congestion pricing, something more similar to what the hot lanes are doing now, except spread across, all of the facilities.
If I might, I do know, I don't see anything in there that talks about incentives for businesses to help with their employees. I know that at one point when I was commuting to DC, the company was encouraged to get us to use Metro. And so I'm wondering if there's any way we could get some of the corporations and businesses that are hiring a lot of people that are doing the commuting to be part of the roadway pricing structure and mass transit and how we can get that more, get them more involved. Thank you. Hello? Hi, I'm here. Did you guys hear what I said? Hello?
Okay,
Sir?
can you hear us now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, we accidentally got muted and it took us a while to both figure out that that had happened and how to fix it. But yes, we did hear you, even though we did not hear our response to you. Which was, that is interesting. I don't think in this level of scenario planning, we're going to get into necessarily the specifics of how we would involve employers or even how we would pay for all of these things. Again, just from the perspective of what if, but that is certainly something we can use in the description of the scenario.
Thank you, Vice Mayor Martinez.
My pleasure.
Actually,
Okay, Supervisor Alcorn?
yeah, I do want to follow because I think what he's talking about is TDM, it's transportation demand and I think that actually is a big enough thing that it should be included.
So yes, I'm just saying, I'm not going to say it's important per se, but yes, TDM programs would of course continue to be incorporated in all of this. And you're absolutely right. Most of these things are in effect TDM.
Yeah, I guess the other comment I was going to make is, you mentioned pricing regionally for parking or curbside. I think that's going to be a big issue on VMT pricing as well. So, I think we have to think about this regionally because this really doesn't work if we don't have a regional approach, especially for VMT charges.
Yeah,
Sure.
so I'm gonna have that be a segue. So I'm really interested in free transit. Yep, and free or maybe really low cost anywhere in the region. So I get on in Leesburg and I could go over to Montgomery County and I just do a whole thing and go.
That will make it easier for people who are economically or vulnerable in some way to not have to be figuring out which transit system.
Or some people like me who are mentally vulnerable and just have a really hard time handling it all. Yeah, exactly.
The Austrian model I was mentioning, they said, I thought, and this could be just me coming up with it, what would I do? But I thought they said that was something like €1,000 a year and you could travel wherever you wanted. That would be something that the financial bit maybe wouldn't be that important, but it would make people say, okay, well, I did spend €1,000 and I can go wherever I want. So I guess I would go wherever.
Right, yeah, they already do that in the R pass and stuff, but yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yep.
So.
I think so, yes. Yes.
Okay, but you want, I'm trying to remember, you said something that really.
I'll just throw one other thing out real quick. Just, as we go through these, I think it's so important to identify what the objectives would be and be clear about that because depending upon, you can create incentives for all sorts of things, but is it, I think we have to go back to the voting.
Yes. I remember what you brought to mind, just when we do the pricing on top of other, like you and I all pay our taxes, right? And we assume that those taxes mean that we have paid for the road. We paid for all these different things. And I think it's a disincentive to Americans specifically to pay extra on top of something unless you're very wealthy, in which case to you it's just enough. But for the average person, paying an extra bit on top of something that you've already paid for really rankles. And that's why I think the free thing, where we actually pay a certain amount that will cover the cost and everybody pays it, so that nobody's out there going, well, how come I have to pay an extra $13 to drive to Vienna when I already paid for that road long since with my regular tolls? You know, I think I mean, maybe that's just the way I think. But I, you know, even when I go to the gym and I have to pay extra to take in a class, but some other classes are free, and I think, well, I already paid to be here and I paid for all the classes, so why am I paying extra? And I think that's a disincentive to the average person to utilize something that we really want them to utilize. I don't know what the answer is, but I just.
Councilmember, anyone else?
Okay, so the last scenario we're going to be a little bit more abstract with at the moment. And originally we had framed this as a climate change scenario we still like. And our original thinking around this scenario had been to look at what pieces of our transportation infrastructure were most at risk from climate change. So thinking about portions of the VRE tracks, portions of the GW Parkway, Reagan Airport, things that might be taken offline by sea level rise, by flood inundation, those things, and really just removing them from the transportation network and seeing how well we function without them. That was our original thought as sort of a what if. We can still do that, but some points have been raised around the fact that the engineers will probably figure out a way to elevate the tracks or the roads or Old Town before they actually sink underwater, and that knowing that it would be bad, as it would be, if the GW Parkway was underwater, isn't going to necessarily help us make a lot of decisions here. So that has been pointed out. And so what we've been thinking might be worth changing this to is potentially taking pieces of the three scenarios that we've already discussed and seeing if the pricing and TDM measures that we've talked about, combined with the automated electric vehicles, combined with the increased telework from the pandemic new normal, if all of these pieces together might really have a significant impact on climate change if we brought them together. And so what we're thinking might be an option there is to wait until we do the first three, see what we learn, and see if we can piece pieces of those together. The one thing we want to make sure we don't do is sort of, COG is doing a lot of work around climate change and air quality. So we definitely don't want to redo work that they're doing because nobody wants to pay us for work that's already being done by somebody else, but also having two sets of numbers out in the world does no any good whatsoever. So we, this Friday, the climate change report is coming into TPV, so we'll have a better understanding of precisely what they've done and what has come out of that, and it might give us a stronger basis for figuring out what this really wants to look like. But that's sort of the thinking at the moment. You guys are welcome to redirect us again, but that's where we stand at the moment.
That seems to make sense. Yeah. So can I toss over a different scenario?
Yeah.
The one thing that I've been thinking of with the pandemic, climate change, civil unrest, is that our region might end up being more autonomous on its own, where people aren't shipping food from everywhere. We're going to have to throw a lot more of it here and working on something. People are bringing diseases in, and so we keep shutting things down, and so maybe people are really going to stop doing a lot of traveling. And then you got crazy folks a lot of places, and they got big guns and things, and it may get just more uncomfortable to be actually leaving the region for some reason. I don't know. So I'm wondering if we may end up getting back more to it's sort of back to the future, but we're more safe, secure right here, and getting a little more autonomous, supplying our own needs a little more, and the people will be doing a lot more inside rather than so much out and in and out. So that, which might change transportation. Yes, Supervisor.
Some of us might be going to Richmond.
Is Richmond in that bubble?
Yeah.
That's a really good question. So who knows where that bubble is?
No, I think the way your opening statement about climate change, I think it makes sense. Olivia, where I think you're going, maybe it's a different scenario, more of a resilience scenario. And I think this tried to combine climate change and then sort of catastrophic event. And maybe we need one that's more catastrophic event resilience. I know it didn't score very well, but yeah, that could be pandemic.
I'm looking at an evolution that it just may end up, there are a lot of forces that may just slow people down from doing so much and have us, it's like the larger version of everybody staying at home and doing the work. I just toss it out there because that's sort of a good change.
Right, I mean, it could be a pandemic, it could be money dries up, and all of a sudden transit doesn't, or, who knows?
You did say that it might not happen.
We may be wrong, no matter what we do.
Yeah.
Again, what if?
It makes me think of the supply chain
Exactly.
thing that we were discussing earlier, I think. Where right now people are saying, or my friend who's an import-export in Norfolk is saying, buy local. Don't order something that has to come from China. Give the supply chain a break. But I do think that we need to be proactive when we think about the environment and climate change. And suggesting that the engineers will solve things leaves out the fact that without us pushing them as elected officials to make those changes, they're not going to, because it's our job to do that. So I would hope that we all will, because it's such a big question in our minds. It's so hard to wrap our brains around what kinds of things can happen with climate, that I think there's a tendency to say, oh, I'm going to worry about civil unrest and roads, and I'm not going to think about, this existential dread that is huge and really important. We need to remind ourselves too.
Okay, thank you. And is anyone who's participating remotely, Vice Mayor Martinez, do you have anything to add?
I'm really enjoying some of the discussion about what could happen. I do think that a lot of our commuters are going through some changes emotionally and fiscally on what are they going to do in the next few years. One of the reasons I retired was I got tired of commuting, and so there might be some of that. And like I said, the land use redevelopments and developments are changing their structure, just like we used to have malls. Well, people stopped going to malls. Online shopping killed a lot of businesses. So who knows what the future is going to bring, but it's nice, or it's interesting to think about what ifs.
Yes, it is. Okay, thank you. All
That's my
right.
favorite thing.
Okay, all right. Any more discussion on this? Okay, thank you. Okay. All right, so now we have the Nbta update.
I will just be brief. I wanted to thank you all for the time that you put forth this effort. As Keith noted at the beginning of the meeting, we are going to ask the authority to adopt the weighting for the performance measures at their meeting next Thursday. And from there, we can really start some of the evaluation and analysis. So thank you. We do the long range transportation plan every 5 years, but it really takes us 2.5 years to get through the cycle of work and meetings and so forth. So we really appreciate your participation. The other thing for the authority's agenda next week is the adoption of the 2022 legislative program. Our top priority, of course, is making sure that the revenue structures, and not only for the authority, just revenue structures for transportation in Virginia do not change. And then we also want the restoration of the $38.5 million that's left from the diversion of revenues from the authority to WMATA. That's always a priority. So those are our primary initiatives. We do have some transportation technology ask, and of course, supporting the FOIA and having some of the ability for especially committees to meet remotely. So those are our items for December 9th.
Okay,
So thank you.
okay, thank you. Okay, and Councilmember Skilling.
Just a quick note, the Virginia Municipal League and its president stand willing to support and gather anything you have. So feel free to email that person. Oh, wait, that's me. So happy to help you however we can and echo that. So appreciate all that you do.
Thank you. Thank you for all you do. Okay, anyone else? Any other questions, comments?
So Richmond is in the bubble because Steely's in charge.
No comment. Okay, is there a motion to adjourn? So moved. Okay, meeting adjourned. Thank you. Happy holidays, everybody. I know, happy holidays. Other way around. So I went on and now